Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So now we're going to talk about another area of macroeconomic measurement, GDP and real GDP. Another way that we try to gauge, not just in the United States, but other countries, the health of an economy. But before we have to spend some time with a model known as a circular flow. This is an illustration that helps us visualize the flow, literally, of goods and services in exchange for money between households, firms, governments, and even other countries interacting with one designated economy. So the visual that we have here is one of many floating around out there that help us try to internalize this concept. And some of this hopefully is intuitive to you. As you can see on the left hand of this diagram, it shows households purchasing goods and services in exchange for money through the different markets that we have for goods and services. But what people don't always think about is how they are, as consumers or households, selling certain factors of production to firms or companies. You might be thinking, what do you mean? Well, think back to the factors of production. There were 4 factors of production. One of them is entrepreneurs. And if I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a business owner, and I need to have the 3 other factors to run my business efficiently. Those were land, labor, and capital. Capital is both in the form of physical and financial capital. I need to get those somewhere. And typically, they get them from average citizens, households, consumers. The most prominent one, of course, is labor. And it sounds a little bit crude to think in these terms, but that's what we do when we go report to jobs. We sell ourselves. We sell that factor of production, labor, to companies who need them to operate. So this is a basic look at the circular flow. But what I want to do right now, and I want you to follow along using your stylus, or if you want to do it on paper because you feel more comfortable initially doing it that way, that's fine. I want to do a circular flow in a little more detail in the way that I expect you to draw it for this class. So once you pick up your stylus, of course, you need to be in Word. You want to go to Review and then click on Start Inking, and let's do ballpoint pen. Now, when you're doing a circular flow, it doesn't matter where the boxes are located per se. You could have in your circular flow the firms or the companies at the top and the consumers or households on the bottom, and then the markets off to the sides. You could have the markets in the top and the bottom and the firms and the consumers off to the side on your circular flow. What matters is, does it flow in the proper sense, and are your labels correct? Are they placed in the right spot? I'm going to stick for continuity's sake with the model that we just saw. And something else you want to note when I'm doing this is how I will try to use synonyms for you, because you want to be comfortable with the different ways of saying the same thing. We've had cases of this before. We've had synonyms that I recommended that you know. This isn't going to be the last time. One of the things that's unpredictable about the AP exam in May is that we don't know which terms they're going to be using. So you don't want to be thrown off if they use some term that we haven't used most of the time. This way, you can show exactly what you know. So at the top, I'm going to have households. But these are also known as consumers. At the bottom will be firms, also known as companies. And as you saw a minute ago, these 2 sides interchange. They conduct transactions and exchanges in 2 major markets. One is known as the factors market, or resources market. And on the other side is the goods and services market, also known as the products market. So we set those boxes up. Now, these are not the only two segments of an economy that buy and sell products and services, goods and services, as well as factors of production or resources. So we're going to add something in the middle here, and that's your government. But let's go back to the outside. So what you want to do, first of all, is think of these arrows as literally a flow of water, and you want the water looking like it's flowing intuitively correctly in the same direction all the time. So let's make an interior stream and then an exterior stream that goes in the opposite direction. If you're doing your circular flow later and at some point your outside stream seems to go in a different direction, you're going to lose points for that. So make sure that you're consistent. On the interior, the government also has streams that interact with these different segments of an economy. So let's go ahead and put those arrows in. In a minute we're going to do some labels, but I might as well throw down the fact that most economies do not operate in a vacuum. It's not just their companies interacting with their government and their consumers, but of course they trade. So we also have on the outside of this three-segment system a fourth segment, which are known as foreign countries. So add a box there. As well as on the other side. Don't forget that other countries will buy and sell resources, but they also buy and sell goods and services. Now, the question is, where do we go from here? Because it's not enough just to put arrows, although I'll finish up the arrows for the circular flow on each one of these international markets. Where do we put, how do we label the arrows? Well, let's stop and think about how we've set this up and what makes sense. So, just starting with households and consumers and the way that is most intuitive to you, households and consumers send money through the goods and services or products market to firms and corporations. Those firms and corporations provide, and I'm going to abbreviate here because this is going to become really full of information soon, goods and services to households or consumers in exchange for that money. Now, we want to be more specific than just saying money. So, what do households or consumers give to firms to pay for this? They give their income. So we're going to label this income. And as that income travels through the market, it becomes transformed. I mean, money is money, but on its face it doesn't look any different. But as the company takes hold of the money, okay, it becomes their revenue. You know, if you've taken business economics and run your own company, that's the term you more readily use to refer to money that's coming into the company. Now, if you take a look at the other side of your circular flow, you have factors and resources market, and as I said before, households and consumers sell factors, they sell resources, particularly labor, to these companies, and so we want to be specific there as well. So what are they sending along this arrow? Land, labor. And I put land because that happens. It happens less frequently today than it used to, but I can think of examples from my childhood where for years I was commuting to school and I saw farmland that I used to drive by, and every once in a while they'd have a crop of strawberries and this little farmer would have a stand out there, and eventually that was bought up by a larger company. He sold out. I can think of my grandmother when I was a kid, being surrounded by all kinds of farmland, and she having in her backyard relatively small plot of land with pigs and cows and chickens. That doesn't look the same way anymore. So this is just another example, in addition to labor, of a factor or resources that companies buy for use later on from households and consumers. And of course, that's what we want to continue to label this arrow as it comes through that market. Now, what do companies send through this market to households and consumers in exchange for those resources? Well, of course, they send money, right? But it's not going to be enough to label this money. Think of it on this arrow as income, because that's how households and consumers think about it. But what specifically is the firm or company paying these people? Specifically, if we're talking about in exchange for the labor factor, well, they're in the form of salaries, benefits, and other forms of compensation. If they're not on salary, they're paid on a wage basis, we would consider that wages. So all those labels need to be present in your circular flow. Now, what about the government? Government's in the middle. They're interacting with these markets as well as these segments of society. So the government, of course, buys goods and services. They need paper, they need machines, they need the things that we frequently buy to operate. So we're going to go ahead and label this arrow goods and services. And we give a very basic label to the money that goes out from the government. We call that expenditures. I'm going to abbreviate, but you need to write it in full form. Expenditures are also known as spending or outlays, and we'll come back to that later this semester. Let's do the same thing on the other side. This label is expenditures, and that's in exchange for factors or resources. Okay, we're getting close to the end here. What about the ways that governments interact with these households and consumers, as well as firms and companies directly? Well, they need money in order to make these expenditures, so they collect money from both households and consumers. The most prevalent way from households and consumers is through income taxes, and from firms and companies, corporate income taxes. How do they give money to companies and firms? Because they do this to support certain kinds of economic activity, both for-profit and non-profit. We call these grants and subsidies. They give money to households and consumers, not necessarily the same people that pay taxes. It's possible that you don't make enough money to have to file income taxes because philosophically we believe below a certain level you should keep every dollar that you have. But some of those same people that don't pay taxes, or some that do, could still get money back from the government, not as refunds from income taxes. We're talking about for specific situations, particularly to alleviate poverty or to provide a security or safety net for people once they retire. And so I'm going to abbreviate here too. But Social Security is one way that the government sends money to households and consumers. Another one is through welfare, although it's been modified and downsized considerably over the last several years. And sometimes it comes to households and consumers through their state and local governments, but the federal government, which is what we're focusing on here, started off by sending money to those governments, who then in turn give it to the consumers or the households, and those are known as transfer payments. Sorry, my diagram's getting so compressed here. I got to practice on using my stylus, but hopefully the audio complements this enough so you know what all the elements are that I want included. So we have corporate income taxes coming into the government, and then for certain kinds of companies, grants and subsidies go out. We have income taxes coming in, providing funding for the government so they can make these expenditures, but some money goes back out to certain households or consumers. Ultimately, what we want to also recognize is how in each of these markets, as I said before, foreign countries are interacting with us. So we have money going out and money coming in both cases. So when you're drawing your circular flow, label all 4 of the arrows on either side of your circular flow as we interact with those foreign countries. Now, if money's going, or let's say factors going out, okay, we're not going to label this one of these arrows factors or resources. For brevity's sake, what we're going to label this as exports, or EX. And then money comes in exchange for those. You want to pair up your arrows on the exterior of your circular flow just like you paired up the arrows throughout the rest of the circular flow. Kind of think of it in a scientific sense. There's, an equal and opposite reaction for every action. So pair them up properly to show that concept. As most countries do, we don't only export, we also import. So the abbreviation for import is IM or M. The abbreviation for exports is EX, but also X. And then, of course, the equal and opposite action for that is money. And then we're going to do it on the other side as well. Make sure that you put the proper label to the proper arrow. An arrow coming in that says EX is wrong, because that's not an export, that's an import, and vice versa. All right, so on the other side, that's what we're going to also add. We're going to add IM or M in exchange for money, and then we also have EX or X in exchange for money. And that's the circular flow. Now, as I said before, there are other models floating around out there. Some of them try to include financial markets as a piece of a larger circular flow. I've got one here that I want you to take a look at. So we'll scroll down to the next page for you to see that. Oops, a little too far. And after having a look at that, we'll come back to GDP and real GDP.